For those of you who weren't here earlier today, my name's Rodger Watson. I'm part of House of Complexity and Adjunct Fellow at UTS Transdisciplinary School. It's really great to see so many people here, and I'm delighted to invite or welcome a panel of guests who I'm really interested in speaking to, one of whom I know reasonably well, Martin. Hello. Martin is a professor and head of Transdisciplinary School at UTS, where I've spent much of the last 6 years working or being affiliated with. And Martin is a designer by background and has researched into emerging technology and how people engage with technology. Dr. Melanie Jansen, to my right, is a poet, but also a clinical, clinical ethicist. Clinical ethicist, yes, yeah. And really is bringing those two parts of herself to the discussion today. A poet, a clinical ethicist, but also a clinician. Yep. And Viveka, we used to work together years ago at UTS when Viveka was in the innovation unit there and I was at the Designing Out Crime Research Centre. Viveka now leads an innovation unit at the CSIRO. Welcome, it's great to see you again. It's been quite a while. So I'd really like to start with a bit of a reflective question around practice and what is it to be a practitioner and what is it to be a practitioner in your world. And Melanie, I think we'll start with you. You have a fascinating bundle of practices there. Could you reflect on how that comes to life in the real world?
Yeah, so my clinical practice is in intensive care and medicine, and I practice in paediatrics, so children's intensive care at the moment. And so there's a whole set of practices that go along with that. And then I also have my clinical ethics practice where I run a service that helps clinicians in the hospital, in another hospital where I work through difficult ethical cases and do education around that. And then I have my practice, my creative practice as a poet. And I've sort of said those all separately, but in fact they all inform one another. And people, you know, often ask me, oh, well, what hat do you have on today? And I just say, look, I just wear all my hats all the time because each thing influences the other. So I find the clinical ethics knowledge and training that I have, you know, then informs my intensive care practice, as does my intensive care practice inform how I practice clinical ethics to some degree. And then the poetry practice is, I can't remember a time in my life that I didn't write poetry. As soon as I could write, I think I started writing poems, and it's been for me it's a sense-making practice. I've realised right from when I was a child all the way through, and that didn't stop through my medical training and beyond. So I guess I have I take a real stand against sort of this binary or siloed thinking, both in how we practice generally, and I found these earlier talks just fascinating today, but also in each of us as a human, that we shouldn't put ourselves into boxes of, are you a creative or are you a scientist, or are you a doctor at the moment, or are you being a mum, or are you, we are all of these things all of the time, and they all, enrich and reflect on the other.
And you've recently published a book, All That Could Be Lost.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's my debut poetry collection. It's called All That Could Be Lost. A lot of the poetry reflects on my work in intensive care and the grief and loss and crisis that goes along with that. There's always a crisis, even when it turns out really well. And I started out writing the book thinking that it was me sort of telling the stories of patients and families that I had walked with through that process. But as I got further along in the book and then through the editorial process with the publisher, I actually realised that, yes, I was telling a lot of narratives about other people, but that it's also my story, and I started to own that more through the book. So the book really lifts the curtain on what it's like to be with people in that moment, and then how that work informs how I deal with grief and loss in my own life. There's some reflections on motherhood, which when you work with critically ill children and with parents all the time, obviously that, having done that work for many years before I became a mother, informed the way I do mothering. But being a mother also informs the way that I practice. And I think, so the book does explore some of those themes as well.
It's interesting also the different roles of being a writer and being an author. Once the book is out, you're all of a sudden this author, and that's a completely different,
Yeah.
different brief.
Yeah, and that phenomenon of once the book is made and published and in shops and out there, it actually has a life of its own that I don't control anymore, which has been terrifying and amazing at the same time.
Yeah. I don't know what you mean. Martin, as a designer, you obviously come from a particular practice, but also you're quite uniquely poised here to comment on the notion of transdisciplinarity. You're head of TD school at UTS. Could you first tell us a bit about your own practice, but then also in your day job as head of TD school, what is transdisciplinarity to you?
So I really liked how both you, Rodger, and Barbara this morning, when you talked about your practice, you talked about it being informed by really your life journeys. And I think that's the case for many of us who identify with transdisciplinary practice. And so for me, I grew up in Austria. My parents got divorced when I was quite young, so I grew up with my mom and my stepdad, who was an electronic engineer, actually not electrical, electronic engineer, but also interested in what we would now today call regenerative farming. And so when I was 6 years old, my parents bought a farm in sort of the Austrian pre-Alps, so the very end of the Alps. Could still call them mountains. I think in Australia we would call them mountains. In Austria we would call them hills. And they transformed that farm over many years into an organic farm. And I still remember the number when you go through this process, you have to be registered with an organization that certifies you. And at the time there were 2 different organizations, and I still remember we got the number 56. So we were the 56th farm in the whole country that was certified as an organic farm. And so because he was also a high school teacher and an electronic engineer, he sort of built a lot of things himself, and we got involved in that from a very early age. And obviously working on a farm, stuff breaks all the time, so you learn tinkering with technology. And then there was the organic side of it too, and sort of the understanding the relationship between humans and nature. And also how to look after nature when you're running something like an organic farm. When I went to university in Vienna, and I remember really vividly going to Open Day, and all of the universities in Vienna had Open Day on the same day. And it's a bit different in Austria, which I actually like as a model, a bit better than here in Australia, because here in Australia all universities offer more or less the same, and so they're in constant competition with each other. In Vienna, universities specialize in a particular area. And so I remember going to Open Day for the business university, because I was really interested in business. I had actually started already before going to university learning how to code, and I wrote the software program that then my parents used to manage the farm and sell the produce. So I was also interested in technology, so I ended also going to the technical university for Open Day, and I'd always loved art, drawing, a little bit of writing. I wouldn't call myself a poet, though. And so I also went to the University of Applied Arts as well, looking at programming graphic design. I ended up choosing information technology because it allowed me to, yes, learn about technology. In the first few years were quite hardcore computer science subjects, but then I was able to branch out and focus on different areas and also take elective subjects from other universities. So I actually went back to business in the second half of my degree, back to business university, back to the arts university, to architecture, to take elective subjects from there. Again, amazing that many decades ago, I was already able to do that without needing to seek special permission. I could just choose these electives from other universities. And I then specifically focused on human-centered design. And that sort of started my journey towards becoming a designer. And I would consider myself now by background as a designer more than an information technologist. But I think my journey sort of informed a constant curiosity for new things and new ways of doing things and new disciplines. And so I kept learning on the job in many ways, which is why I love being an academic, because it sort of gives you permission to keep learning as you teach new programs and also as you do your own research. And so I moved from design to innovation and creativity, and that's how I landed at UTS in the where I've now got the privilege to be the head of the Transdisciplinary School. I'm an academic by practice, but I feel I'm an academic, and maybe that's the case for many of us at the Transdisciplinary School, who's never lost touch with industry, so was kept afloat in industry. And there were many points in my career where I was contemplating or considering going back to industry. And even when I started doing my PhD, I was like, okay, I'm going to do a PhD, but I do not want to become an academic. I'll afterwards transition in industry, but then there was this amazing job here in Sydney, back then at the University of Sydney, and so I accepted that. But I managed to always bring industry back into my academic practice and stay close to academic practice, and that's also really important to us at the Transdisciplinary School, where we have a network of over 1,200 industry partners and about 2,500 individuals that we engage in our programs across teaching and research. I'm going to pause there because I already gave you a very long answer, so maybe we can come back to the definition about transdisciplinarity, which I would love to talk about as well, but maybe come back to that later.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. And such a, I guess what I take away from that is right from the start, your practice was situated in your farm. And so you were looking for different practices that could be useful as you formed your own practice. So thank you for that. Viveka, you're the convener of an innovation lab at CSIRO. Could you tell us about that and tell us a bit about your practice? How did you land there, and what are you doing there?
So I don't often land places. I try and kind of wrest them into being from whatever is available.
Yeah.
I suppose that's what's been happening at CSIRO, but not like with a huge amount of help, which I can talk about. My practice is as a designer and technologist, really. And sort of unlike Martin's kind of problem-focused, real-world situated origins, I was just a dreamer. Messing around with computers when that was obviously a bad idea, and a waste of time. Drawing pictures with computers when they were terrible for drawing pictures. Spent quite a lot of time doing that. Just because I have like raging inattentive ADHD, and I'm tremendously curious and can't stop learning. So design grabbed me. Like when I was heading to university, there was the first design degree in Australia. I was the second cohort through at COFA, now UNSW Art and Design. And that's, I mean, I can talk a lot about design, but that's design as, or it was design as imagined as a political project at the Bauhaus, right? Design as an intentional project to give art the status of the sciences, right? That was, kind of a pre-World War I Weimar Republic idea to say, let's make art so give arts such a fantastic reputation for solving problems that it will be elevated to the respect that the sciences have. There's a Bauhaus manifesto that sets it up very explicitly, right? And the school that I went to took that and took the Bauhaus program pretty much. Textiles, interiors, industrial, architectural, all of the kind of everything you can put under the word design. And nowadays designers are often doing service and systems design, and kind of, you can keep, as Eliel Saarinen says, you always go one layer out. A chair, if you're making a chair, you want to look at the room that it's in. If you were making a room, think of the house in a streetscape, the streetscape in a city plan. So that's fun. You can always look one layer out, right? And design as a set of approaches, abductive reasoning and doing things and testing things is very amenable to lots of different things. But I don't think it's just a problem-solving thing. It's an exploration and problem-finding activity, complication activity, and its main power is that it can, if you think of design as problem-solving, which many people do, that's kind of the double diamond stuff from, Barnes, and before that, the creative problem-solving. Yes. Sorry, I'm nerding out. Anyway, creative problem-solving was a huge idea from advertising that you could be a consultant and solve people's problems for them by thinking outside the box. And they got but they could only really write reports, and their impact was limited. And then when design adopted these approaches, designers can make prototypes, right? You build things. And I love to build things. It's just my nature to build things. So I'm a technologist. I was making robots when I was a kid, reading a lot of science fiction. There's a lot of stuff I chose not to make because sci-fi warned us against it, which people are now making. That's called the torment nexus, which you know about. But yeah, so later on I went into research in technology, and I was very fortunate to land at the Creativity and Cognition Studios at UTS. So, and that was when Professors Ernest Edmonds and Linda Candy had founded that space. It's a really fascinating space. There's still remnants of it there. And Andrew Johnston, who took on that lab after there, is still there running various really exciting things. The amazing thing about that lab at UTS is that it was in the Faculty of Engineering and IT, but it admitted people from design. So it was not a transdisciplinary school, but an interdisciplinary school, right? In that intersection, and Ernest and Linda are real figures in the world of practice-based research. So doing practice, and that practice itself, and what you find out through the practice, being the research that gets you a PhD, which I'm still working on. Andrew, I'm still in the system. I've become a much better writer, so thank God. Anyway, but writing's the hardest thing that I do. I don't do it naturally. Talking, obviously, I do a lot of, and drawing. I can't think without a pencil. But yeah, so my practice, though, it's design and technology. And again, I'm ridiculously fortunate that CSIRO, uniquely among, so CSIRO, as people call it, as it's called officially, there's the inside term, people say CSIRO because it's faster. Probably half the people in this room already knew that. And also, if you look at the history of things made by CSIRO, they're often called Sci something, CSIRAC, Australia's first computer, for example. Anyway, unique among national science agencies in the world, it has a design department. It is the only one, right? The closest you'll get, NASA has a human factors engineering group, which are stolidly engineers who secretly do some design, right? And human factors is how engineering thinks of design. Sometimes I call myself a human factors person. Sometimes in the system, our designers at CSIRO are called engineers. I'm called a research consultant, I think, in the system. But yeah, it's a historical artifact, a fact like there was a thing called NICTA, National ICT Australia, that was a technology research, not a science research institute, that was then folded into CSIRO, and it brought its design department with it. Hilary Sinnis, who's now at Salesforce, created that capability, and it lives on. I'm not formally in the design group anymore. I'm in the product group because that's where design, as I see it, systems design is done today. So yeah, there's way more. What am I doing?
Wonderful. We'll come back. Yeah, we'll come back.
I've got
Thank you.
projects and approaches and.
I'm interested to hear about Concept Lab, but I'll let you gather your thoughts as we circle back.
I've been going.
So Melanie, in intensive care, you're obviously working with a bunch of different people from slightly different backgrounds, doctors, nurses, anaesthetists, etc., and then different specialties. There's something really special that happens in intensive care that is more than the sum of the parts of those disciplines. How do you reflect on that as a unique practice within itself?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And often my colleagues in intensive care, we say, because on the one hand, we are whole body doctors, so we specialise in the whole body physiology, but we do rely on our subspecialty colleagues who specialise in just the kidneys or just the heart or the brain or whatever for that really niche expertise in those areas. So there's the other medical specialists. And so there's never a patient in ICU that we just own on our own. They're always admitted under somebody else. And really in this day and age, there's usually at least 2 teams involved in their care, and that would be a simple ICU patient, And then, of course, there's the whole ICU team, which is a 24-hour service. So in the unit that I work in, there's 250-odd nurses, right from new grads all the way through to very experienced senior nurses. Then there's physiotherapists, music therapists, social workers, sometimes psychologists, and all of those associated specialties in other teams that consult us as well. So we do really see a huge part of our job as contextualising all this, I'm going to call it, I was listening to you talking about this, the Convenor model, and I thought healthcare is kind of mostly chaos, I think. But there are like little swirls of complicatedness in there where I think the multidisciplinary approach of recognising these very specific bits of expertise works very well to work out certain parts of the piece. And then as the intensivist, our role is one, to do the intensive care management, which is usually the organ support, ventilation, ECMO circuits, that sort of thing, and help prioritise all that other information that we're getting to make a coordinated plan for that particular patient, including, looking after the family and helping them through that and helping them to make decisions about what is the best thing to do for this person who, by and large, doesn't have decision-making capacity themselves, especially in my field where we look after mostly young children. But, so I think it's a real, and we are often the people that are stepping back a little bit and asking the bigger directional questions about where is this going and what are reasonable goals for this patient. So I think that we put a lot of emphasis in our training on developing good communication skills. It'd be great if we did more of that. And I think our approach to the whole body physiology is that very much that probing thing that often we have to make decisions in uncertainty, and you treat, you resuscitate and think about disease modifying things at the same time, and sometimes the response to therapy is itself sort of diagnostic. So there's all these probes that you're constantly doing while also constantly trying to sit back. And then, as you can imagine, with all those literally hundreds of people involved in one patient's care, there's an enormous amount of relationships to manage, and when those are going well and we have a lot of trust amongst our broader team, you can really see how much that pushes everything forward, with at the same time our own research projects and quality improvement projects and things happening in the background, the training of our junior doctors that rotate through, that's all getting done at the same time. So I think the most powerful thing that makes all of that work is focusing on the relationships that make the team run,
And I guess that's where some variance can come in. Done a little bit of work at the local health district level, and it's fascinating to see the differences in culture and differences in practice. Presumably you've worked in a number of hospitals. How orthodox is the practice, and is good the same good everywhere or not?
I think, all healthcare institutions have as their basic goal to improve the health of the people that walk through the door, amongst other things, and we have the same lofty mission statements that happen in the corporate world. And I think the broader organisational culture is one of the constraints within which you work, and that can be negative or positive, or mostly a mixture of both. I think in healthcare we have sort of very good, especially in Australia, because we're a small population with fairly centralised health systems. We've actually got quite good analytical systems with big databases. Every child that gets admitted to intensive care in Australia, all their clinical information goes de-identified into a big database. We've got lots of analytical power to help us answer questions. I think we're starting in a fledgling way to really focus on the human connections and how to leverage that. And I think that is the thing that I notice the most, both in my intensive care practice and in my clinical ethics practice, is that the profound effect that the quality of the relationships can have, and the effect of different power structures, like certain specialties have more power in the system for a whole load of various reasons than others, and that can impact on care in good and bad ways. I feel like I'm not really answering your question.
No, I think so. No. But I guess where I was going with that is there's something special that emerges out of all of those disciplines coming together, and that that thing, if it could be bottled, might be an exemplar of an excellent transdisciplinary practice.
I think when people actually, because we always talk about multidisciplinary in healthcare, and I think that is appropriate for a lot of the more discrete problems that we're trying to solve. But I think when you have a really good multidisciplinary meeting, and people go, oh, that was a really good meeting, like we've got a really good shared vision and we really know what we're doing with this patient, and everybody understands how they're going to play their role in this, and you can see a bit of role like blurring happen and things. So I think when we all go, this is a really good multidisciplinary meeting, it's actually when we've turned into a transdisciplinary team. And I'm going to have a confession. I had heard the word transdisciplinary before I came, before I got invited to speak at this event, but because I marinate in this multidisciplinary or alleged multidisciplinary system, in reading and preparing for this event and doing some of the prep, I think that when we are doing things really well in healthcare is when we've morphed over into actually having a transdisciplinary approach. Yeah.
Thank you. And Martin, the TD School is really there to foster the emergence of that transdisciplinarity across so many different contexts, and with a whole bunch of disciplinary inputs at the academic level. Could you reflect, you've been at the school now for a few years, could you reflect on the different, firstly your take on transdisciplinarity, but some examples, I guess, of where we've seen that humming that seems to occur here when everything clicks?
Yeah, really interesting to listen to you, Melanie. And I was going to ask whether you use the term transdisciplinary when you describe the work you're doing, because it sounds very transdisciplinary. I was wondering what terms you're using. And also interesting how you're saying it's kind of like it feels like something's clicking, and then that's when it becomes transdisciplinary. Well, I'm going to borrow a metaphor that actually I heard from a good colleague of mine to explain the differences between inter and multi and transdisciplinary. And I know the morning panel also touched on this as well. It's somewhat simplistic. It's about food, but it's I found it really helpful when I first heard it myself. And so it's essentially it's comparing inter-transdisciplinary with a salad. And a salad has multiple ingredients. It might have lettuce and carrots and tomatoes and onion, and they all come together to make the salad. But when we eat the salad, we can still taste the unique components. So they sort of work together, but they're still very much their own. When we consume the salad, when we have the product the salad as a product, interdisciplinary then is the example there is a soup. So again, when we make a soup, we take a number of ingredients, we put them in the blender, and we make a soup. And so the soup is transforming the individual ingredients, and it becomes something new, like a new substance. But when we eat the soup, we can still taste the flavor of the carrot and maybe the onion, and maybe it has cumin in the soup. We can still identify those flavors. It's not a full integration, and it's not creating something that is new entirely. And then the example for the metaphor for transdisciplinary is the cake. So when we make a cake, we take a number of ingredients, probably egg and flour and some baking agents. Maybe there's also carrot in it as well, if it's a carrot cake. And we put those all together and put them in the oven, and something magical happens. And it's not actually magic, it's actually chemistry. But what happens is that the ingredients all transform, and they're also, amazingly, they all respond to heat in their own way, but they sort of come together as a whole to make a cake. And the cake is something that is entirely transformed in that it's a new structure that is different to the original ingredients. And when we eat the cake, we may also no longer be able to taste and identify the individual ingredients, original ingredients. And so that aligns very much with the definition we heard in the morning panel as well, that is this sort of more scholarly discussion around how transdisciplinarity is about integrating knowledge from different disciplines and working across, between, and beyond disciplines, and sometimes creating something entirely new. And sometimes that entirely new thing could become a discipline in itself, maybe. It's still a very academic definition, and disciplines are also a very academic construct in a way. I don't think industry as much talks about about disciplines, maybe at CSIRO. And so what's important with transdisciplinarity, though, is that we bring other actors into the process. So it's involving co-creation with people from industry, from government, from communities. So they're being brought into this process. And that's also an important distinction for us at the UTS Transdisciplinary School, that there's a few factors that make the work we do transdisciplinary, which is focusing on real problems and real impact, and doing that through co-creation with external actors. And then the third one, what I already mentioned, the integration of knowledge across disciplines. Now, people from industry we still might go like, still sounds very academic. So I'll try to maybe bring that more into a practice context. And I was talking to Mark Rowland, who is the founder of Climate Action Week Sydney, amongst many other things. We were working together on organizing a net zero summit at UTS late last year. And we were talking about these distinctions, and he was like, let me help you translate this into industry language. And so he was suggesting that multidisciplinary is kind of like working within the silos of a company. And it essentially means that all of the departments, which are the silos in the company, they all try to achieve the same shared goal, which is defined by company vision or strategic plan. But in many cases, the departments and the silos might not even talk to each other within the company. And so that's multidisciplinary. For interdisciplinary, he suggested that's cross-company. The example is cross-company, so departments across the company working together, talking to each other, and also working with the partners and talking to the partners as well. So it's a more of an integration of knowledge across the companies and the partners, which might be the supply chain sector, supply chains, for example, and sectors from the supply chain. And then transdisciplinary, he was calling cross-sector collaboration. So that's where companies work beyond their own sector and even work with their competitors. And that's really important. And it's not how we describe it in academia, but it is actually important. And I have heard people working in industry describe that the need and highlight the need that to deal with the complex challenges of our time, things like climate change. When you're working for an insurance company, for example, you have to work with your competitors because the challenges are so complex. And you can no longer solve the problems by just working internally within your silos or within your company and partners. So did I answer your question? You were asking about some examples, but maybe I'll pause again because I feel I've spoken a lot again.
Okay, thanks, man. We'll come back to you.
Yeah.
So Viveka, at CSIRO Concept Lab, how do you see this playing out? And obviously you've been taking notes there, so make it seem like your notes are an answer to that question.
Yes, yeah, it's okay. I was listening. That was very fascinating. So, yeah, the Concept Lab is an interdisciplinary space, I would call it, where transdisciplinarity is possible. So, and I think that was framed really well. Like it's, you know, if you're working, like disciplines have have their advantages, right? They have discipline to them. They're understood. People can know that they're really good at their discipline because it has, you know, it's a field of knowledge. And you can figure out what your expertise is. You can have a shared language. It's a very valuable thing to have disciplines. But in times of change, new disciplines have to emerge, and interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity can be how that happens, right? And it can be really vital to do that in response to changing external conditions. Climate crisis is a great one, right? You know, the wealth crisis. These things that are, if you look at the civilizational arc, coming to a head, demand really creative responses. So my practice at the Concept Lab is, and I took the name from back in design school. They would always tell us to figure out what our concept was, and we didn't know what they meant. And they couldn't tell us because they didn't have PhDs. It was new. They were practitioners. It was a kind of an apprenticeship, right? But we could learn it. And by the time we finished the 4-year degree that took me 5 years, we could do it, even if we couldn't articulate it. But a concept is just a shared understanding, right? And if you look at a clock is a bunch of stuff made out of different things. You look at an iPhone, it's a lot of technologies. It's got a name that people recognize, and people say this is this thing, right? It's a shared idea of a thing or a shared idea of, like, it doesn't have to be a physical thing, but right, that's all you're doing. And it's a big thing to have to do, to say we have all these disparate parts. So at CSIRO we have some new scientific breakthroughs. We have industry partnerships. We have people with problems. There is a myth in Australian innovation culture and policy sometimes even, that there's a pipeline where a breakthrough becomes a technology, becomes a product. It's just not true, right? Like, very rarely true. Maybe in pharma sometimes, biomed occasionally, sort of. You get a new molecule, you figure out what the molecule does, you can maybe productize that in a pretty straight line. Most areas, it's not like that, right? It's much more about an assemblage of things that make sense to people in a time, in a moment, and that has significance and meaning to them. And kairos, the opportune moment of action for it to come together into something that can be named and enter into the culture, right? So that's my research background, is creativity studies. And Margaret Bowden, everybody should read Margaret Bowden, B-O-D-E-N. There are two Margaret Bowdens, and they both have, they're both MBEs. I'm talking about the one who's a creativity researcher and also has been working in computational creativity for many decades before it was cool. And all the AI intelligence researchers really, really need to read her work. She talks about three kinds of creativity. What have we got? We've got exploratory creativity that I enjoy, where you do stuff and you put things together, and creativity comes from exploring a possibility space. Prototyping is part of that, one of those things. Artists do a lot of exploratory creativity if they're just, playing with the marks they're making. You've got combinational creativity, putting things together to compose them into a new thing. And this is what industry does a lot of. We call it innovation a lot of the time, right? And then there's transformative creativity, which is, and Rodger, you worked with Kees Dorst, right? Who has amazing work on frame creation. So framing things, thinking, like, deciding, articulating how things fit together and how you should look at things is an incredibly powerful thing to do, right? And I think very often transformational creativity comes from a reframing. So that's, at my best, I create space in the lab for people of different disciplines. So generally that's scientists from all different fields of the natural sciences mostly, which CSIRO mostly works in, or the formal sciences like computing and economics and things like that, right? So we have a lot of scientists, we have a lot of engineers, we have some designers. I bring in people from outside as well. Technologists are often really interesting people. They go off, in order to figure out what to build, you have to do some philosophy. So, so I try and bring technologists into the lab. And we have it set up as a space where you can draw and you can write code, and you've got access to, all of the flashiest gear, but in a way that it's okay if you break it, in order to let people explore and to argue with each other and have time and space like we're having today to sometimes have an epiphany and say, oh, I see. And like, crossing disciplines is such a powerful way to do that, and so rarely done. Like, the opportunity space, the headroom for this is vast. There are so many chances where if you get, someone like Mel, an intensivist, and, the things that you're thinking about in the terms of the incredibly complex system of the human body and all of the experts that are working together and the human mind, as you do it, right? The psyche, right? You've got psychologists, you've got music therapists, right? Like, somebody who's, and you're an ethicist as well, so, you're bringing all of these things together, and imagine putting you together with somebody who could completely rewire one of the important machines that you rely on to work in a totally different way. These types of collisions, these interdisciplinary collisions are the meat of what we do, and we get out of it, we get new systems that kind of routinely transform how people do important work. So.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
there?
please.
For me, really fascinating. For me, creativity is about connecting dots.
Sure.
And so what he's saying is essentially about, in many ways, that it is about connecting dots. And I mean, the saying goes, the more dots you have, the more creative ideas you can come up with. And that can happen for me, that can happen in an inter or transdisciplinary setting. And going back to my example of the definitions in an industry setting, so that can happen if you're working across the silos within the company and with the partners in the supply chains, and can happen even more if you then go cross-sector or transdisciplinary, where we bring other companies from other sectors into the conversation, and maybe other actors and maybe more competitors. We have more dots to connect, and therefore can come up with more breakthrough ideas. Yeah. And I also love what you're saying about it's never a linear path, and I think that's what I found really fascinating about the process of design and design thinking as a way to formalize that. That it's a non-linear path, and it sort of captures that really nicely. And that's also, I think, why design thinking became very popular. And what I like about that is because I guess because I grew up on a farm, I think I'm quite pragmatic. So there's the transdisciplinary school around it being about a way of being, and that sometimes, like was discussed also in the morning session, can be a bit confronting for people. And I guess it's a temple metaphor, right? For me, maybe because I'm quite pragmatic, I like to bring it back to methods. And that's what was really great about the design thinking movement, that it gave people methods to engage in simple things like brainstorming and ideation and prototyping, and sort of making it really easy and accessible to pick it up and kind of trusting the process. And the same is true for transdisciplinary approaches. We can also, yes, it's about a way of being and understanding yourself at the temple, but it's also about using methods in the right way and bringing people together from different sectors.
Yeah, and just thinking about those sectors as different fields of thinking or fields of thought. We've talked a little bit about science, a little bit about design, engineering. The arts has come up already today, and I wonder around how the context of the farm or the emergency unit. I wonder how you as leaders in your fields bring those different dots together, or get those dots on the page to see what can emerge from that, because there is a bit of an art to engaging an artist, as we have in the corner over here, Simon, into a creative process in a way where they can feel welcome and feel valued. So perhaps a bit of reflection on that. And
I'll jump in. I have so much on that. So one way is space and place.
Yeah.
Right? And Martin talked about bringing in people from different industries, and you've mentioned the arts as well, and people from all kinds of places and approaches and with different ideas. So bringing in, there have been great successes in technology development from bringing in science fiction writers. Right, this is very well documented. I tried to bring in poets, woodworkers, First Nations people, knowledge holders. And I'd say the work I'm doing currently specifically on participatory design with First Nations knowledge holders for climate and biodiversity and agricultural things. And in that space, transdisciplinarity is the only option. There is no legitimate discipline that works with First Nations knowledge holders that they trust or should trust, right? So you have to create a space. And so it isn't always about bringing in somebody with that title. Like you will find, so I work, with, Mel, for example, is a poet, right? In the workplace, she's an ethicist, but she also has these other aspects to her. I work with someone who's I work with people who have various job titles, but they all have much more depth to them. They have previous roles that they've had. They had things that they're deeply interested in. They have people in their lives. I know a lot about early childhood theory because of my partner, and I'm learning about history, and this is just from influences from, and that doesn't make me an expert, but it makes me somebody who has some awareness of these areas, right? So creating space and place to welcome in more of people is, it's an HR buzzword, but it's in these, but for good reason, right? Like in these, if you set the stakes right, if you invite people, the most useful practice, and I think we can talk about practices, that's a really good idea. The most useful practice I've come up with is writing the right invitation. So I sent out an all-staff email at CSIRO that sounded completely bizarre to like 90% of the people there, saying, come and dream about future digital worlds. And the 5% of people who got excited by that and the 5% of them who showed up were incredibly valuable participants, right? And so creating the right invitations and saying all comers who respond to this invitation is one really useful practice to get that collision. And to get those surprises from the combinations and the potential for transformative, new framing comes. I think, creating place like this is, we have too many projects in Australia and not enough places.
Can I jump? Oh.
Yeah, no, you go.
Well, I was just thinking about you creating these spaces, and that's one of the reasons that I have been drawn to poetry, and in particular trying to put it in the healthcare setting, because I think poetry's it can be quite easy to kind of wedge open a little space in these very hectic kind of environments. And one practice that I've done for quite a few years now is we have a big multidisciplinary ward round at the start of the day, and I've once a week, I just decided, if I'm on a Sunday, I'll do this on a Sunday. And the first time I did, I said, anyone mind if we read a quick poem before we start the round? So there's like 20 people, all these different specialties waiting. Oh, okay, sure. So I read a poem, and it was Emily Dickinson's "If I Can Stop One Heart from Breaking." I was working in the cardiac ICU that week, and it was this. Literally, it would have taken me 20 seconds to read this poem, and maybe we had 5 seconds of silence after that, and people went, "Oh, thanks, that was really nice," and actually just felt the register of the room drop a little bit, and we then proceeded with our ward round, and then afterward, a couple of people, one of the senior trainees from one of the other specialties came up to me and said, "Oh, I really liked that. I follow this account on Instagram that does these little poems like this," and I looked, "Oh, great." And then, some later in the day, somebody else talked to me about something. So it opened up these relational moments. It gave everybody a moment to reflect and just join together in what we're all doing here. And I've started to do that much more regularly, and sometimes even just at the start of the PICU ward rounds, or I've now worked kind of humanities teaching into the registrar and some of the nursing teaching programs, and people just love it. And I think I have often reflected, I've thought, why do I care so much about the humanities in healthcare? Because I couldn't articulate really why I thought it was so important. And when I did a Churchill Fellowship actually 10 years ago now, and I visited lots of medical humanities centres around the world and ethics centres, and there was a senior sort of paediatric neurologist from the north of Italy and I said, why do you think humanities is really important in healthcare? And he said, well, to be a doctor you have to learn about disease, pathology, physiology to do the kind of mechanics of the job. He said, but it's humans that get sick, and it's the humanities that teach us about humans. And I thought, that's it. And every time you bring the humanities in, there's all this emerging evidence about skills you get from creative practices. And one of the things that I think is really important for healthcare is, there's lots of evidence about how the development of empathy is really good for your professional longevity, your relationships with patients, and therefore their outcomes. But I say, well, you can't have empathy if you don't have an imagination, because you have to be able to imagine being in somebody else's shoes. And what do all these disciplines help drill you in? Imagination, engaging with film, books, poetry, thinking about other people's perspectives makes your imagination better, which just makes your empathic capacity higher. So I think there's all these actual skills that we can probably articulate and describe. They don't have to be relegated to the woo-woo tacit learning realm. And I think we can make them much more explicit, but also there's these reflective practices that come from the arts that help join us as a team, as humans, and therefore, we function better, and it's better for everybody's well-being, including the people that we're looking after.
That's a really beautiful example, and I guess, because we each come from, we may all come from a different discipline and practice, but poetry talks to our emotions, and emotions is what we all have in common as human beings.
Yeah.
Beautiful, yeah.
Well, I often think, and in my clinical ethics practice, I feel like what I'm often doing is trying to get to the heart of what really matters to everybody in that, who's involved in whatever case we're dealing with. And it strikes me that poetry is all about what matters. One of my poetry mentors, Mark Tredinik, and another lecturer that I'd had when I did poetry at UQ, they both said, when you write a novel, there's a bit of mechanical stuff in there. People have got to get into the car and out of the car and into the house, and you've got to talk about all these things to kind of set up the scene. But poetry, all you do is write the stuff that matters. You distill out the stuff. And I think, Mark says, poetry is what happens when you expect more of language. And I think that the way that poetry just is always trying to drill into what really matters to us as humans and present that in different and thought-provoking ways, even that as a skill is really useful for relationships, because what we're trying to do is really communicate to each other our own felt experience so that we can all, and thoughts, so that we can have a better group understanding and go forward. And so I think, another example of a philosophy and skills that go with a certain creative practice that help in other practices.
Yeah.
I'd also like to respond and pick up to what Viv was saying. I think that's what makes the UTS Transdisciplinary School really unique, that we have academics from different disciplines all being together in a space. So you talked about creating a space and time for these things to happen. And that's something that is unique in Australia and also globally to the UTS Transdisciplinary School, that UTS has created this space. And that makes a massive difference because of the silos that universities have, just the same way companies have it, and it's really where sort of knowledge is held within the faculties and the disciplines of the faculties, and it's very sure we can sort of work across in some ways. As a researcher, I can collaborate with someone else and do a collaborative research project, but it's not the same as being in the same space and having time together. It's not always easy. Our slogan is "Great minds don't always think alike," and that's definitely true. So there's a lot of also friction that comes from that, and it is definitely easier to agree than to disagree, which is the danger of groupthink, of course. And by disagreeing, we often unearth the things that matter most and the more complex issues, and find maybe the new ways of addressing those issues. Just this morning, before I came here, I was in a PhD assessment panel where we had an organizational scholar, an innovation and entrepreneurship scholar, an anthropologist, and someone who works as an academic in corporate sustainability, and all giving feedback on the same project, which is a transdisciplinary PhD project, which is amazing. That's very, that doesn't happen automatically. It only happens when we create the space and the time for that.
Yeah. Martin, can I ask, in that space, because one of the problems that's been noticed in healthcare is that there's sort of two broad reasons that people don't speak up and challenge. And one is if there are really dysfunctional team dynamics, power imbalances, and fear of questioning, like the team leader, so people don't speak up. But the other is when everybody likes each other so much that they don't want to rock the boat and harm their good relationship and then this has been sort of studied in resuscitation-like settings, which is obviously a very particular thing. But I was just wondering, how do you manage that in the transdisciplinary school, that phenomenon, and drawing the right balance?
It's a really good question. It's not something that one person alone can manage. It's something that we all have to constantly work on together and invest in. And so creating the culture and an environment of psychological safety and mutual respect is really, really important. It doesn't always work, but it's something that we constantly have to keep doing.
Yeah. What are the things that you keep doing to create that, the micro moments?
Well, it's culture is something that shapes over time, forms over time. So it's lots of things that we do over time, starting from basic principles around transparency of communication and decisions being made within the school, not talking about the whole institution, within the school, coming together to celebrate moments. That is both birthday cakes that we do monthly, as well as celebrating wins and outcomes and achievements of staff. Sometimes calling out people and empowering or reminding in particular our leaders in the school that they have to do that, that if something goes wrong in a meeting, that they have to call out, like if there's a situation of where someone is not respecting the other person's opinion, which might be different, to call that out on the spot and deal with it on the spot. So those kind of mechanisms, which I guess a lot of those come back to basic good management principles, but they're not easy.
Yeah. So then there's a cheat code as well, which is to do the Saarinen thing of going outside the organization, right? Like, so within a hierarchical organization with rules that have built up over time for good reasons at the time, some of them still have good reasons and some of them are just craft, whatever it is, right? You get, like, that is a really tough problem. And, these approaches can ameliorate the tough problem. At MIT, one of the places I studied, they used to have a building called Building 10. I don't know. It was a temporary structure that was very strong because it had to be used to invent radar during World War II. It was supposed to be torn down immediately afterwards. They never got around to it. And it became the place where people from different faculties that didn't really have a lot of funding or rationale would end up, right? And people would just bump into each other from completely different disciplines. And if you're talking to a senior professor, if you're a grad student, you're talking to a senior professor, and you're in linguistics or in semiotics, and they are in electrical engineering, the hierarchy is broken, right? They're not your boss. They're not in your chain of command. It's okay. And then you can bridge things and you can get across. So these spaces where you create, and so within organizations, you can do things like create more social spaces, like, shared cafeterias, shared pigeonholes, force people to bump into each other. There's lots of examples of that. But then, and you can have a culture of cosmopolitanism, like what you're doing here, being outside the organization, engaging with the organization, celebrating that with, at all levels, if we say it's part of, we celebrate it if people don't just stay super focused, but also if they engage beyond the org. Because that's kind of a cheat code. If you go outside the organization, you're freed from that really difficult constraint to a great degree. And people can, places like this are really valuable.
There's also a cautionary tale regarding that building, because although so many Nobel Prizes came out of it across different disciplines, the university at some point tried to formalise it and engaged a very good architect, Frank Gehry, to design a replacement building for it.
Oh, God, yes. And the Gehry building, everything inside it couldn't be moved.
Yeah.
So, which is the opposite of the adaptable space that it had been. It was famous as the only building on campus you can cut with a saw, right? Yeah. And then Gehry made this beautiful space that nobody could touch. Yeah, it is super tricky. But I think I'd really like to touch, again, if we get back to it, on the importance of poetry and philosophy and literature and fiction in figuring out why, what matters and what.
That's something that's quite explicit in the practice that I teach. And Viv, you mentioned Kees Dorst, our dear colleague. He's over at Princeton at the moment, but still at TD School at UTS. And having had the pleasure of working with him since 2010, back when his frame creation approach was quite fledgling, quite abstract. And as a team, we had to apply it and develop it, apply it to real-world complex issues. And it was through that where we really lent into the arts, poetry, literature, cheesy 1980s film clips, art, to try to get a deeper understanding of what is really at stake. So after a whole bunch of analysis around identifying stakeholder needs, etc., what are the core things that really matter here? And we're not necessarily experts in those things, but people in the arts are. They form entire careers about deepening knowledge or deepening expression on one or two themes. And so why wouldn't we engage with that as a way of forming our own or deepening our own experience? Another tool, Martin, you mentioned design thinking before, and it's interesting to think of these processes in terms of a collection of tools that are put together in different ways in order to serve different purposes. So that was about deepening our individual art. But in a book that I worked on with Barbara Doran over there, we looked at the art of the renku and turned that into a collaborative process where we would identify a couple of those deep themes, those deep values that really mattered in a situation, and then give a team a structure in order to co-create a renku poem. I've used it many times, but just down the road, maybe even in that building, I'm not sure, with the Department of Education on a strategy day, we got them through a whole process of identifying stakeholders, what are the problems, what are the paradoxes, what are the values, and now you're going to write a poem together. Not because you need to agree on something, but because you need to share an understanding of something.
Yeah.
So I guess that kind of falls into the philosophy territory of not searching for truth, but searching to create meaning together.
Yeah, I like that idea, and I often think of that in my work in healthcare, is that you think I'm sure everybody who's had a glancing acquaintance with any kind of healthcare has heard the term shared decision making. So when I started medical school, I remember being told that my job was to turn into a doctor, which is a sort of detached expert body mechanic. And I thought it sounded hideous. And thankfully, there's been much, I think that idea still persists in healthcare. But I think one thing that I often talk about is when, both in my complex and difficult conversations I have with families in intensive care, but also in my clinical ethics job, is that those philosophical skills of actually getting at what are the assumptions here and what are the values from which we are acting is really important. And that way of even just the basic logic argument mapping can help get you part of the way there, but without taking away the emotional experience. So for example, in ethics consultation, I say we need to do a bit of information gathering at the start. So we get all the clinical information, and then I used to call it narrative information, but I've started calling it we're now going to look at the facts of the felt experience of everybody. And so actually get into how people feeling about this, how has this played out for various people. And often people come to ethics consults really, they're worried about something, that's why they're there. And sometimes the clinical information gets put out and I sort of go, so if this, then that, and we expect this, like there's obviously something else here though, otherwise you wouldn't all be here. And so I just encourage people to go, well, what's the feeling there? And then once you kind of articulate that, because I say, if you feel bad about something, there's probably something bad about it, right? So let's figure out why we feel bad about it, or why certain people feel bad about it. And then that gives people go, oh, okay, I've now given you permission to go there into your human self and bring out this information. And you get all this rich, ethically relevant information that you can then make the decision with. And it's, I think, therapeutic for everybody involved. And that shared understanding is built by listening to your emotions and the way that your body feels, and then making it explicit. But if I come back to the shared decision making that you do with families, like if I'm talking to a family about whether we should continue persisting with fairly uncertain therapy or whether it's time to redirect our goals to sort of palliative goals, like this is a huge decisions for families to make. And people often go, oh, well, you need to explore the family's values or discover, as if they exist there, ready to be discovered by your shared decision-making questions. But a mentor of mine, senior intensivist and ethicist from Boston and Harvard, actually said, what you're actually doing in those conversations is helping people work out what their values actually are, and not because they don't know how they're going to feel until they're in this situation. And being in these situations brings things into perspective or makes them think of things, and you need to help walk them through that, listen to what they're saying and say, well, if this is what you think, I often say, what are the things that are important to you for your child to be able to experience and do and be in their life? And people have wildly different answers to that question, but based on their answer to that, I can say, I think the chances of them being able to do those things are almost zero. Right? So, in that case, I would recommend we do whatever, and then they might go, well, maybe it doesn't matter so much if they can do, well, I don't. And then you go back and forth, and what you're actually doing is helping them build and articulate their values in the situation that they're in. And I think, and I say this when I'm teaching, the registrars about having these conversations, is when you realise that your role in that conversation is actually to help them work out what their values are. The responsibility of that conversation is so much bigger than if you were just discovering what already exists. So the need to hone that skill and do all of these things and engage with all these human building skills that we have becomes like an ethical imperative of itself. Yeah.
Wow. And I think it links back to what my colleague Barbara Doran this morning talked about. Again, this idea of being, and even sitting on a couch is a certain way of being and how we feel in a sense. And it makes sense the way you describe it in that situation, in that conversation with the family members. I wonder how this translates to a corporate setting. Like, talking about House of Complexity and the practice that Stephen is creating here. How do you do that in a corporate setting, where you also, like, do you ask the client, how do you feel? Do you start with that question? Like, how do you, or I don't know, Rodger, you part of House of Complexity. How do you do it in a corporate setting? How do you bring that to a corporate setting to make sense there?
Yeah, as I was saying before, there's just so many tools that you can use and lean on. I think your articulation of your practice in that really poignant, important moment is great. And I reflect back on many different workshops and conversations that I've had over the years and that we've had as a community of practice. Setting the trusted environment, making people feel safe and bounding it to a certain aspect. So when I say that, making people feel safe, it's giving them the opportunity or the permission to think outside of the current frame and the current paradox or paradigm that they're in. Not because we're going to tear the whole house down, but because if we step outside of where we currently are, we can understand more deeply where we might like to be. And so many different tools to unpack just at that values level. I mentioned the Renku before, the thematic exploration. You can even, as an individual exercise, do something called a nomological analysis, where you look at the word itself and explore antonyms and synonyms and experiences of when you've felt that value yourself, when you've experienced it yourself. And I would say in the framing process, this is the most important part and the part that we spend the most time on, because if you don't have a quality depth of understanding around what's actually important, then your reframe is going to be based on junk. And if you base your reframe on junk, everything else is going to be junk, right? So it's got to be an authentic, felt and experienced understanding of what's really important here, what's really going on.
And Rodger, do you think that exercise that you did of writing the Renku poem is really a way of creating a bit of cognitive space for that group, for bits of their subconscious to come out, or for them to just, And is there a better name for that part of the process than information gathering, as I called it?
Yeah, I mean, we call it thematic analysis, theme exploration. And in, Viv, you mentioned
incubation, is that
well, no. In the abductive logic process, or the innovative abductive logic process, it's a process of sustaining your fixated belief that the why in the situation is true, that the how is true, and that the what is true. So you're creating cognitive space for people to reflect on what is actually important, and even to rethink the values that are stated as being important, and then rebuild and reframe from that. So if you thought it was all about freedom, for example, in your organisation, if you thought it was all about freedom, but with a bit of exploration, you come to an agreement or an understanding that it's actually about agency. Freedom and agency are two different things, with a lot of different strands that you could go off around how are we going to create agency, what actions are we going to take. And so, practically, and to answer your question, I do bring in that American pragmatist philosophy into the workshops, and I explain, okay, we've been educated to think deductively and inductively. Here's an abductive reasoning pattern. Here's some tools to help facilitate you through it. And it can either be done in a workshop or just over time, chipping away, building the trust, building the deeper understanding. I would say that the more communal it is, as in the more people involved in that process, the stronger, richer, deeper the understanding of the new value is, but also the more robust the reframe can be, because people are going to share that understanding of the deeper themes at play and have a stake, have fingerprints even on the reframe, in order to be part of the thing going forward. And Steve mentioned Government Architect's Office conversation that he had. I had a conversation with the same guy about 10 years after I facilitated a process using this approach on his organisation. And that was a process that engaged a core group of members from the Government Architect's Office in New South Wales to rethink the value proposition that they have. What are the values that they're trying to create in the world? And how can they better organise themselves in order to achieve that? Now, this is a bit brutal. About 120 people lost their job as a result of that process. They would have lost their job anyway, but at least the bunch of people who were involved in this process had agency in reshaping the future form of the organisation. And a bunch of them, once they've served the terms of their redundancy, came back, but in a more strategic role. And in that, it was literally that abductive logic of deframing where they currently are, where an architectural firm owned by the government competing against the private sector. That makes no sense to anyone. Therefore, they're on the chopping block anyway. But then working with them to gain that deeper understanding of the values at play, help them phoenix, to use a term from construction, into an organisation as a thought leader, and stop designing buildings, but facilitate excellence, facilitate processes in a different way. Yep. With a lot of hindsight and retrospect, that was not a psychologically safe environment for those people. And we did our best over many years to work with them to bring them through that process. And I would probably do things differently if I knew that 120 people were ultimately going to lose their jobs. I would probably do something a little bit different, or maybe not engage.
Yeah. I think we can take. There's a big unlock in something that Mel said earlier about rejecting the expectation of becoming a kind of a robot doctor, right? Yeah. And I think a similar thing can be said of designers and agencies. There is a kind of a curse of the professional remove that I was trained in, and that I never fully accepted, and have now decided that was right. It's like if you have an attitude that you are entirely there at the service of the client to meet the client's articulated goals, you're not a professional, right? You're a professional if you're subject to standard management practices and you are executing a predefined outcome that you wouldn't necessarily want to put your name to. That's not professional. That a professional has higher standards that they ascribe to, and that is part of the value that they deliver. For clients, entities, organisations, whoever it is that's engaging that professional, or whatever they engage with themselves or construct, if that, hopefully, having those values gets you the right people, right? Because having been a freelancer, the only power you have is to fire the client, right? Or to choose who you engage with. And the wonderful thing is that it's a big world, right? And so if you create this pose where you say we are, which is not happening here, like which the big consulting agencies will tend to do, to say we are functionaries, you can trust us to do precisely what you want, we will be in the service of power, that will get you one kind of client. But if you say, here's our mission, here's our goals, here's what we believe in, if you engage us, that's what you're getting, then you get, you have a chance that you're not going to get Peter Thiel, that you're going to get somebody who's actually read past the first sentence of Anna Karenina,
Yeah. Viv, can I pick up on that? Because I think what you're saying is we all come to whatever it is that we're doing as humans and bring our human stuff with us. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, when you're sitting with a group of people trying to work out a difficult pencil drop.
That was going to happen.
And so people go, well, we just all need to leave the emotions out of it and make a rational decision. And I just go, oh. And I said, hang on.
There's no such thing.
And so there's no such thing. I said, if we don't make the emotional side of this explicit in our decision making, all that will happen is that they will be there and drive the process inappropriately. So
beautifully put.
Yeah, that's why, because you can't. We're humans. Everything we do is based on how everybody's going to feel about it afterwards. That's the whole reason that we exist and everything that we're trying to do. So, and it's not that. I mean, I love the rigor of analytical reasoning and abductive reasoning, and I think it's very important. But it's not you can't, like, how we feel about things becomes part of the reasoned approach to what we do.
Yeah. It's the meaning, it's the reason. I've heard from designers and engineers there is an aphorism that there are two stages to the project. There's doing the right thing and then doing the thing right. And I think a lot of what we're talking about right now is doing the right thing. And that is entirely a human values question.
And it's kind of not to say that you shouldn't have professional boundaries, because they are very important, but it doesn't mean that you have to be the detached expert body mechanic. It's okay for me or anybody else in whatever practice to personally kind of get something out of it. You need to make sure that the primary goal is still the person that you're that you're serving or looking after, and that who you are impacts upon that. And then if you don't accept that, then you can't make sure that who you are is impacting on that in an appropriate way. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah.
And is that the biggest pitfall or biggest trap of not engaging or not being able to engage with this kind of practice authentically? That you may yourself have a process in mind, but working with, if it's a client master-servant relationship, for example, your client master might ask for the rhetoric but not be up for the action. Is that a big trap that we often fall into?
The most useful practice that I have developed is finding out as much as you can about the espoused values of whoever you're working for and hold them to it. Because at some point they articulated these values, right? And that is a powerful tool. And another thing can often be to try and, just learning more and more and more about, every organization that exists came into existence for a reason, usually driven by somebody who had a vision. Right now, maybe it's lost its way, maybe it's become a machine, maybe private equity is trying to make it do something different. But at some core, there is a purpose to everything. And if you go back and go to the National Archives and read the letters of the people who founded things, you can often get really, really powerful arguments. They don't do everything, but they're very powerful, and you don't usually get fired. You just become... In any organizations are multifarious as well, right? They have many aspects, they have many people with different goals and intents, and you can become part of the coalition that's providing ammunition and empowerment, as you did, for those people who were going to lose their jobs. You were still able to empower those people as people beyond the constraints of the role of the engagement, right? So you can make. Large organizations are systems of alliances, right? You find your way to play.
I feel I want to come back to the methods, because we've both talked about methods, and I like your answer to my question about how to translate what Melanie was talking about into a corporate setting, and frame innovation in a way is a method, and it's using the corporate language, but it's also about values, understanding and framing values. So, but what's important, and also to my earlier point about the value of methods in transdisciplinary approaches, whether it's something like systems thinking methods, like systems mapping, there's also a risk to that, because that can also be applied in a disciplinary or silo setting, and then it's not. Well, it's still great to probably still good to use the method, but it's not transdisciplinary. It's probably still, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's still leaving gaps.
It's within a scope.
Yeah, because it's kind of like siloed, and so again, that's why it's important. The methods is just one part, and it's also about how we apply the methods, and that we need to bring people together from the different sectors, from the different disciplines, and use those methods together. And systems mapping is a great example because, I mean, a systems map is always incomplete, but the more voices we can bring into the process, and the more perspectives we can bring in the process, the more holistic the picture will be, and the more complete the picture will be, and the more we can make sure we're not missing important gaps. And I think in a corporate setting, it's important to use the right language to actually get somewhere with that. And so again, that's why I like the language, the notion of frame innovation. In my own research, I do some work now on life-centered design as a way to sort of shift away from human-centered design and just focusing on the needs of humans, which has in many ways led to many of the problems we have today and was primarily good for stakeholders, designing more things that more people want and buy, and making more money for the corporation. And there are other academic terms that I use, like value-sensitive design, and there's other and even more than human approaches, but often they don't land with industry, whereas it's something like life-centered design, people in industry get. They go like, oh yeah, we get that, we can adopt that. So it's kind of like it's also about creating something that's safe for industry to adopt. And they can then pick it up and use it themselves, and it becomes a powerful concept. Is that the right use of a concept here? Yeah. Becomes a powerful concept for people to use within their corporate settings and to actually then drive change. And one more thing in that regard is that when we talk about complexity, house of complexity and complex problems, it can be often quite overwhelming. Like if you look at the climate crisis, like where do we start? What can we do? And often our students say that as well, and our PhD students go like, how can we make actually change? How can we actually change something? And even if you work as a designer in industry as well, so I've been working with a colleague, Steve Betty, a bit on some frameworks around that, and he came up with this idea of the 1% change. And it's kind of like, yes, there's all this stuff we need to change, but in order to start a shift, we just need to focus on the 1% that we can change. And sometimes that's even maybe changing the language we use, or changing how we engage with people and who we engage. And over time, that change that it compounds and actually then has a bigger impact. But it makes it more feasible and more manageable and less daunting in a way to think about what is 1% that we can change or start changing.
The biggest thing that changes if you change a process is the people who engage with that process.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They mature, people are amazing, right? Like everybody has an entire brain and body and networks and connections and right relationships and life and history, and there's billions of us, right? And as activating people, we've seen this, you'll see this so often if you do a systems change. Like people will be, I was at Choice working on consumer rights. People were very interested in energy bills. We did a thing that there are 6,000 energy bills in the market at any one time. The energy bill you're on changes every 6 weeks. This is 10 years ago work, right? But it's incredibly complex to figure out what energy bill you wanted to be on, and that was people's overriding concern. As soon as we solved that for them, they suddenly got interested in solar power, right? Like they didn't care at all. Their bills were bugging them, right? We switched them, we saved them $400, and all of a sudden they wanted to come back to us and say, oh, should I get a battery, right? They became energy nerds, right? People change. There's an observer effect in innovation that's really strong. And and it's unpredictable, but any action is as you say.
We're coming to a close, and I'd just like to ask one final reflective question of each of you. If there was one thing that we could amplify or dial up to ensure that we are making sure that different perspectives can be part of what we see in the world, what would that one thing that you would dial up be?
For the whole world? Give me a minute.
Yeah.
So with 1%. I can jump in if you want a moment to think. I mean, for me, I started this conversation talking about my university journey and how I was able to draw on different knowledges during that time. So for me, the one thing we need to do is making this more accessible to students, making transdisciplinary learning experiences and approaches and concepts more accessible to students across the world. Here at UTS, we started doing that where we are teaching, we've introduced a new transdisciplinary electives program, which makes this available to all undergraduate students at UTS. So UTS's vision is that within the next few years, every undergraduate student that goes through UTS does at least one transdisciplinary subject, where they have to work with students from other disciplines together, using transdisciplinary methods and working with an industry partner or an external partner on a real-world problem.
Thank you.
I think what I would dial up, because I mean, being someone who crosses the arts and STEM, I mean, I love STEM, I love the scientific part of medicine, but that type of knowledge is so privileged, particularly within healthcare, and I think in the rest of the world, that what I would dial up is recognition of and strategies for an engagement with the arts to feed that. Yeah.
So it's a tough one. I'm trying to make it into one. I would dial up opportunity and capacity. Give people space, give people time. Like it is okay, this is a book about poetry by Gaston Bachelard. He was the inaugural chair of, I think, the history and philosophy of science at the Sorbonne in, I think, around 1910. Okay. While working as Postmaster General, he was able to pick up an encyclopedic knowledge of poetry, right, and philosophy, and then bring that to his practice. So, this is a book all about just poetry, about space and somewhat about place, mostly about space. There's a chapter on corners, right? There's a chapter on nests that begins with the kangaroo pouch. It's been quite influential in architecture, and he's just quoting poets and talking about how they talk about space, right? And that influenced how he thought about phenomenology, right, which is the study of the interior experience that we've been talking about, like the thing where there are things in science you can't study because they are, well, the only person who can understand them is the person experiencing them. It can't be observed. Like we might do brain scans, but it's not the same thing as qualia, exactly. And intersubjectivity, and he was able to have a massive influence on the understanding and depth and of the course of the sciences by being a Postmaster General who read a lot of poetry, right? If people are working 12-hour days and have to hyper-focus, and PhD students are expected to read everything in some tiny, narrow field, and scholars are meant to publish 200 papers a year, well, it's getting there. I know people celebrated for publishing 50 or 60 papers a year, and it's going up, right? This pressure, this intensity to focus is going to kill us. The over-specialization is going to kill us. It doesn't give us the breadth. So I would try and dial up space for people to explore space and time, like this. Thank you.
I'd build on that, V. And over the last 5 years, I've got into music a fair bit. I've always been a fan. My father was a rock star. I've got his instruments now because he's dead. But I've really got into composition and becoming proficient enough to start composing. And for me, that's unlocked something that was dormant. I'd always loved music, and I thank Barbara for her subject, Creative Practices and Methods, because it was sitting through that subject the first time it ran as an observer, but picking up a guitar and strumming it while Barbara was talking or while the others were talking, that helped me, I guess, give myself the permission to enjoy something that my previous life had seen as a privilege that I wasn't deserving of.
Yeah.
So I think if there's one thing for me, it would be that not everyone needs to pick up a guitar, but I would hope that everyone is able to pick up something, whether it's a pen or a pencil to do poetry, whether it's tinkering on the farm with technology, coding. I think it's really important as humans that we have at least one thing like that. And with that, we're out of time. So thank you very much.